90% of the large mammals in Europe have vanished from the natural landscape in a period of only 150 years. This mass disappearance has submerged entire ecosystems into a state of gradual collapse where biodiversity breaks down and ecological cycles that operated for thousands of years begin to fall apart. Why can bringing back a vanished species restart an entire system in decline? It seems simple to assume that planting forests would fix the damage. But without the presence of large herbivores, the soil becomes compacted and the natural links that once kept the landscape functioning are severed. The ambition to restore these wild spaces never became a reality despite numerous attempts across the continent. One can notice how the absence of these animals leaves the undergrowth stagnant and the nutrient cycles broken. It only looks obvious that trees are the primary component of a healthy environment, but in reality, trees are not enough to save a failing ecosystem. The true solution emerged from a species that scientists had declared extinct in the wild more than 100 years ago. It gets more complex further on. Europe tried every traditional method of conservation to halt the decay of its wilderness. One can notice how the land remains silent without the movement of heavy hooves and the natural grazing that prevents overgrowth. The process is only gaining momentum as researchers look past the forest canopy to find the missing ecological links. Because the key to restoration was not found in the plants, but in the animals that shape the terrain itself. Therefore, the reintroduction of a single lost species acts as a catalyst for the entire biological chain. The camera glides along the rejuvenated meadows, where the soil is once again aerated by the presence of heavy wildlife. Thus, the focus shifts toward the return of the ancient fauna to mend the broken cycles. The material for a complete ecological recovery is now being gathered through these unconventional methods. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing as the first herds are released back into the wild. 1919. That was the exact year the final wild European bison was killed. One can notice the total absence of ceremony or public awareness surrounding this event. No one at the time realized that this specific moment marked the point when the largest land animal in Europe vanished from its natural environment entirely. Why did such a massive population disappear so quietly after thousands of years? It seems simple to blame a single event, but in reality, the decline was a slow collapse spanning centuries of human expansion. The historical range of these animals once stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia and from the Atlantic coast to the Caspian Sea. Researchers estimate that their population previously reached hundreds of thousands or even millions of individuals across the continent. The decline of the species did not begin with modern warfare. Humans had hunted bison for food since the hunter-gatherer era, but the real turning point arrived with the massive expansion of agriculture. Overhunting, when combined with large-scale deforestation, gradually destroyed the habitat of the bison over several hundred years. The species was not wiped out in a single dramatic moment, but was instead slowly suffocated by the relentless spread of civilization. By the early 20th century, many conservationists believed the fate of the bison was already sealed. A species that had successfully survived the Ice Age and thousands of years of extreme climatic upheaval could not survive one single century of modern human activity. At that time, more than 50 European bison remained, but every single one of them was held in captivity. Everything only gets more complicated as World War I erupts like a final strike against a population already standing on the edge of total extinction. One can notice how the chaos of occupation led to bison being hunted for their meat, hides, and horns by starving soldiers and local populations. It gets more complex further on. After the war concluded, only 2 small and isolated herds remained in the entire world. 9 individuals in the Białowieża forest in eastern Poland were hunted down systematically until the last wild bison there was killed in 1921. The other remaining herd sought refuge in the remote mountains of the Western Caucasus, but their isolation provided no permanent safety. 6 years later, poachers located and shot the final individual in that region. The European bison was officially declared extinct in the wild, ending a lineage that had once dominated the European plains. The era of the wild bison concluded in the silence of the forest and the high mountains. This marked the end of the first chapter of their history, leaving only captive individuals to represent the species. The transition to the next level of their survival would depend entirely on those few animals remaining behind fences. 800 kilograms is the approximate weight of an adult European bison, making these creatures nearly as heavy as a compact car. Why did such massive animals develop the ability to move at speeds 3 times faster than a human? At first glance, their sheer bulk and height, which often exceeds that of an adult man, suggest a slow and lumbering nature. But in reality, these giants can leap over obstacles that appear impossible for such a heavy frame to clear, demonstrating a surprising level of physical agility. Bison are strictly herbivorous animals that generally prefer to avoid any form of direct conflict. One can notice how they choose to retreat rather than engage in confrontation when they encounter potential threats. It seems simple to categorize them as dangerous based on their size, but their gentle temperament makes them one of the least aggressive large mammals in their natural environment. This unique combination of power and calm allowed them to occupy a specific niche in European history. The process of their survival is only gaining momentum. European bison evolved specifically within dense forests and mixed landscapes, distinguishing them from their American relatives who favor open grasslands. They graze on various grasses and browse on young branches and shrubs as they move between thickets and natural clearings. This feeding behavior is exactly what establishes them as ecosystem engineers. It is visible how they actively rebuild habitats from the ground up by opening the forest canopy. They do not merely exist within a landscape, they directly shape its structure and restart biological cycles that have stalled. Where these animals are present, many other species begin to recover in their wake. Therefore, protecting the bison is not just about the preservation of a single species, but about the maintenance of the entire web of life. It gets more complex further on. One can notice how bison foraging creates a mosaic-like landscape where open patches and mature vegetation interweave. This specific environmental structure allows countless plant and animal species to flourish in close proximity. For instance, by creating space for flowering shrubs within the forest, they attract various insects. These insects then draw in birds and small mammals, creating a cascading effect that spreads through the entire region. An ecological paradox emerges when the largest animals create the specific conditions required for the smallest organisms to survive. Biodiversity remains a tightly interconnected system rather than a collection of isolated entities. The point where the two bison species intersect is not found in their physical form or habitat, but in the identical fate they once faced. When their living space disappears, even the most massive species are erased from the record of history. The material for their survival is currently being reconstructed. Thus, the story of their recovery moves to the next phase of ecological restoration without haste. 50 individuals were all that remained of the entire European bison population when they finally vanished from their natural wild habitats. This remnant group carried a heavy and invisible burden known as a genetic crisis, where the biological diversity of the species had reached a critical minimum. Why did such a small number of survivors pose a lethal threat to the future of the animal? With an extremely limited gene pool, inbreeding was no longer a mere risk, but a mathematical inevitability that threatened to degrade the species from within. Many scientists believed that even if the bison did not face immediate extinction, they would gradually weaken, lose their reproductive capacity, and eventually disappear in total silence. One can notice how a small group of determined conservationists refused to accept this grim outcome. This movement was led by the Polish zoologist Jan Stoltzman, who issued a call for urgent and decisive action to save the lineage. Alongside him worked Heinz Heck, the director of the Munich Zoo, and his brother Lutz Heck, who managed the Berlin Zoo. Together, these specialists coordinated massive efforts to gather every remaining bison from various zoos and isolated private reserves across the continent. But this is just the beginning. The process of organized salvation gained momentum when they founded the International Society for the Protection of the European Bison. It is visible how they presented a comprehensive plan at the International Nature Conservation Conference held in Paris in the year 1923. At first glance, the task of tracking animals seemed simple, but in reality, it required a level of administrative precision never before seen in zoology. In the year 1932, the European Bison Pedigree Book was officially established to serve as a biological ledger. The equipment and records of the era allowed for meticulously recording every single individual and controlling every breeding decision with the goal of preventing a total genetic collapse. It gets more complex further on. The central question was not only whether the species would physically survive, but what form that survival would ultimately take. There was a constant tension between maintaining the bison as a truly wild animal or allowing it to become a permanently managed population. The records grew as the scientists monitored the slow recovery of the calves. This systematic approach ensured that the bloodlines were tracked with the same rigor used in industrial engineering. One can notice how the pedigree charts expanded over the decades, creating a roadmap for the survival of the species. The material of life was thus preserved through strict human intervention and scientific oversight. Every birth was recorded, and every movement between reserves was planned to maximize the health of the dwindling population. From here, the transformation of the bison from a disappearing relic to a recovering species moved into a long-term phase of stabilization. Thus ends one of the most critical stages in the effort to prevent the total disappearance of the European bison. 1929 was the pivotal year when the first European bison were finally released back into the wild. This momentous event took place not by symbolic coincidence, but as a calculated return to the Białowieża forest. Why was this specific location chosen for the reintroduction of the species? It was the exact site where the very last wild bison had been killed just years prior. The population began its recovery from there, growing slowly but with technical consistency. Over several decades, the animals gradually expanded their range into other major forest massifs across Poland. One can notice how the bison numbers rose into the hundreds through careful management and monitoring. It seems simple to assume that increasing numbers equaled success, but in reality, an unavoidable question emerged among the scientific community. Could these animals truly return to a state of complete wildness after so long? Many scientists raised objections regarding the genetic and behavioral memory of the species. The process is only gaining momentum as the debate intensifies. The equipment of modern biology could not provide a definitive answer to whether a species living for generations behind fences could still remember the mechanics of survival. It only looks obvious that instincts remain intact, but reality required a harsher testing ground. The answer lay in Romania, specifically within the Carpathian Mountains, which represent one of the last remaining truly wild landscapes on the European continent. If the bison could not survive the rugged terrain and harsh climate of this region, they would likely not survive anywhere in a natural state. The camera glides along the steep slopes, where the animals must now find their own food and navigate without human intervention. Everything only gets more complicated as the bison face the transition to the next level of autonomy. Observation of the herd shows how they move through the dense undergrowth, their massive bodies clearing paths through the ancient trees. The equipment of the research teams remains at a distance, recording how the bison adapt to the Romanian wilderness. This stage determines whether the decades of captive breeding were merely a temporary measure or a permanent solution for the species. Thus, the bison reach a critical point in their history, transitioning into a phase where the wild environment becomes their only regulator. 180,000 hectares of old-growth forests, deep river valleys, and alpine grasslands in the Carpathian Mountains became the focal point for a large-scale restoration project launched by Rewilding Europe and WWF Romania in 2012. Why did this specific region of the southern Carpathians become the epicenter for the return of the continent's largest land mammal? The sheer scale of the landscape offered the necessary isolation and biological diversity required for such a massive ecological undertaking. 200 years passed before the European bison returned to the Romanian Carpathians on May 17, 2014. Engineers and biologists constructed a 15-hectare acclimatization enclosure to protect the foundational herd of 17 bison. This secured perimeter allowed researchers to monitor health and behavioral patterns while preventing poaching incidents. One can notice how the equipment gradually reinforced the boundaries of this zone to ensure the animals remained safe during their initial transition. The process is only gaining momentum. At first glance, the initial phase of the project seemed like a guaranteed triumph, but in reality, the early years of reintroduction did not resemble a success story. predators killed many of the first calves born in the enclosure. Harsh winters claimed the lives of several weaker individuals who could not withstand the plummeting temperatures. Within the herd, hierarchical relationships shifted constantly, which triggered physical conflicts and high levels of stress among the animals. It is visible how the social structure of the group struggled to stabilize under the weight of these environmental pressures. Everything only gets more complicated. But then, something science cannot program began to emerge: the development of learned behavior. Those individuals born in the wild carried no memory of captivity or human intervention. They learned how to read the complex landscape, avoid natural dangers, and move in rhythm with the dense forest. One can notice how the younger generation began to navigate the terrain with more agility than their predecessors. After 2 years of intensive observation, the first herd was fully released into the wild. Transition to the next level. Subsequent reintroductions took place in 2018 to bolster the existing population. Not every release was completely successful, but each event provided more data, more technical experience, and more confidence that the bison could survive on their own. The camera glides along the forest edge, where these giants now roam without human assistance. The process concludes this phase, opening the road to a permanent restoration of the species. 100 individuals. This was the exact number of European bison living in total freedom within the Carpathian Mountains by the year 2021. This figure represents more than a mere statistical milestone. It serves as physical evidence of a self-sustaining population capable of surviving without human intervention. Why is the spatial distribution of these animals considered the primary indicator of success? While a captive herd remains static, these bison expanded their range across more than 200 square kilometers, moving far beyond the boundaries of their initial release sites. This territorial expansion confirms that the species has reclaimed its original ecological role, functioning as a wild entity rather than a managed curiosity. One can notice how the presence of these massive herbivores produces immediate and measurable transformations in the physical landscape. In the specific zones where the bison settled, the variety of plant species increased by approximately 30%. Monotonous, dense forest blocks are gradually broken apart by the animals' movements and feeding habits. They are replaced by complex mosaic landscapes where grasses, shrubs, and stands of young timber coexist in a natural balance. The bison perform mechanical tasks through their daily survival routines. Their dust-bathing pits act as small depressions that retain rainwater, while their dung provides concentrated nutrients to the soil. As they move, their thick fur traps seeds, transporting them across distances of tens of kilometers. No human hands coordinate these specific environmental shifts. The bison do not technically restore the nature around them. Instead, they trigger a biological chain reaction that allows the ecosystem to heal itself. But the Carpathian Mountains represent only a single fragment of a much larger continental shift. 10 years after the initial reintroduction efforts, consolidated data from the European Bison Pedigree Book and the International Union for Conservation of Nature revealed a massive recovery. At first glance, it seems the species was confined to history, but in reality, the bison have returned at a continental scale. It gets more complex further on. Poland and Belarus have emerged as the global leaders in this recovery, with each nation hosting populations exceeding 2,000 individuals. These regions are no longer just the final refuges of the Białowieża forest. They have transformed into primary source centers that provide the genetic material for rewilding projects throughout the rest of Europe. Beyond these central hubs, the species has reappeared in a diverse array of territories, including Germany, the Netherlands, France, Denmark, and Spain. The expansion continues into Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, Russia, and across various Balkan states. According to technical data updated in the year 2024, Poland alone is now home to approximately 2,800 European bison. This specific achievement would have been viewed as a biological impossibility during the early years of the 20th century. The equipment and monitoring systems tracking these herds reveal an underlying truth about the species. Bison are not merely returning to the most remote wilderness areas of the continent. They are gradually reclaiming landscapes that were once considered permanently closed to the presence of large wild animals. The materialization of these herds across the European map marks the conclusion of a century of intensive conservation. the population continues its steady growth, securing its place within the modern ecosystem. 9,000 individuals is the total population of European bison across the continent today, a staggering increase from the just over 50 survivors that once remained. This return did not occur in a social vacuum, as local communities immediately expressed concerns regarding potential crop damage. Questions about human safety emerged as the animals began to move through the landscape. Why is rewilding considered more than just a biological challenge? The process only looks like an ecological effort on the surface, but in reality, it is a complex and ongoing process of negotiation. One male bison recently traveled a greater distance than any recorded individual before him. He swam across the cold waters of the Oder River and crossed the Polish-German border, marking the first time a free-ranging bison had done so in more than 100 years. It seems like this should have served as a powerful symbol of the returning wilderness of Europe. However, the journey ended in tragedy. Within only a few hours of his arrival, German local authorities shot the animal out of a sense of fear and uncertainty. One can notice how this single event exposed an uncomfortable truth about modern conservation. The process is only gaining momentum as the nature of the threat shifts. While poaching still exists in certain areas, the primary danger to the bison today is no longer the hunter hidden in the deep forest. Instead, the greatest risk is the direct conflict between wildlife and the specific ways humans currently utilize the land. This is why the work of conservation cannot simply end with the act of releasing animals into the wild. Rewilding organizations find themselves forced to establish compensation funds for farmers and train local guides. They must open direct channels of dialogue with the surrounding communities to mitigate tension. In reality, the amount of recorded damage caused by these animals remains remarkably low. But fear does not disappear through the presentation of statistics alone. The equipment of modern life has made us forget how to share landscapes with large herbivores. Adaptation must therefore come from both sides of the equation. Humans need to overcome deep-seated fears and understand the gentle nature of the bison, along with the ecological services they provide to the soil and vegetation. At the same time, bison must be supported in learning how to navigate safely through settlements and farmland on an increasingly fragmented continent. Everything only gets more complicated as a new form of economic value begins to emerge from the presence of the herds. Bison-centered ecotourism now brings approximately €2 million per year to the region. Guest houses, restaurants, guiding services, and local craft workshops have gradually developed to support this influx of visitors. Not everyone benefits from this shift in equal measure, but for the first time in many decades, wild nature is no longer viewed strictly as an obstacle to regional development. It has transitioned into a functional part of the local economy. It gets more complex further on as the population continues to grow toward the 10,000 mark. This success raises a harder question than any previous technical achievement in the field. How much physical space does Europe still have left for large animals, roads, intensive agriculture, expanding settlements, and even new renewable energy projects all compete for the same limited territory? Rewilding is not an attempt to turn back time to a pristine or prehistoric version of Europe. It is a calculated process of redistributing space, and no available option comes without its own form of pain. Pulling a species back from the very brink of extinction and returning it to the wild is an extraordinary achievement for modern science. The history of the European bison serves not only as a conservation victory, but also as a blueprint for rewilding other large species across the entire continent. But it also exposes a much larger question for the modern world. If nature truly returns to its former habitats, how far are humans actually willing to step back? The past 10 years have only been enough to begin asking that question with the seriousness it requires. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing as the species continues its expansion.